I would like to welcome you to LocoFoco Netcast and your Professor Michael Rectenwald. And may I call you Professor Rectenwald? Or
just call me Michael, please.
Very good, Michael. Should the professor title be term limited to the terms of service?
No, it's an honorary title.
It is an honorary.
After achieving it, it's honorary, and I was a full professor at NYU when I left.
And famously left.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've read your first book.
And famously.
Yeah, exactly. I've read your first book, Springtime for Snowflakes.
Oh, wow.
And enjoyed it. I have your second book, which I read about half of it. And I bought your most recent book, Beyond Woke, twice. Mainly because I lost one copy. So
you were beyond woke then, I guess, maybe.
Well, I'm approaching there.
Or under woke. You weren't woke enough to keep the book in hand.
Exactly. I'm looking at the title page, or the cover. Authors often don't have control of the covers, but did the two different kinds of eye have a meaning there for you?
Yeah, I mean, I picked the artist this time, and picked the cover. This guy was a very avant-garde sort of commercial artist, and I loved his work. So yeah, it's one eye is woke, and the other eye is beyond woke. One eye is open, and the other's even further open. It's a kind of it's a meta wokeness.
I don't suppose you got any reference to the Eye of Horus and things like that from ancient Egypt, did you?
No, but there is a reference to beyond good and evil there.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely Nietzschean reference.
Well, we're living in very woke and in-your-face wokeness times. And in fact, I think I saw something on Facebook where you're planning to do something in Seattle. Is that correct?
I'm thinking about it. We'll see if there's any momentum that builds. But why not just march right through that place? It's public space, and they don't own it. And peaceful march right through the center of it, I think, is an act of defiance against their usurpation of space and their illegitimate overtaking of that area, and also the symbolic resonances that they have somehow controlled a certain amount of area, and therefore they don't claim autonomy anymore. They did until they had to ask for some food from the outside. But I think that something needs to be done, not to let this thing just sort of extenuate itself without any interventions at all. So I'm thinking about that, and we started a page for it, and if the momentum builds, then we'll consider a date and the rules, because it would have to be a highly disciplined body, because we can't have people running in there shooting anyone. It has to be highly disciplined and only acting in self-defense if necessary. But I hope it wouldn't.
Not even rubber bullets? Are you excluding rubber bullets? Just asking for a friend, as they say.
I'm not saying what people are allowed to carry. I think we would follow the laws of the state, which would be unlike the insurrectionists there who are following their own laws. And I guarantee you none of those people have permits to carry, especially open carry. I can guarantee that. But, I mean, what I'm saying isn't the contradictions that they represent are just so stunning. That they're armed, and that the left, of course, is trying to disarm everyone. Right. But it's only arms for them, just like freedom of speech is only good for them. It's typical of Marxists to be against freedom of speech, or to be for freedom of speech until they're in the ascendancy, and then they start shutting everyone else's speech down.
Well, you used to be one of these people, right?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, I was a Marxist. I was a left communist.
Timo and I were talking about apostates. I mean, you're probably familiar with some of that history.
Yeah.
We could roll off a bunch of names, like David Horowitz is one example. And
sure.
Sidney Hook. I don't know that he completely abandoned his Marxism, but it goes on and on.
Yeah.
Do you think it's odd, though, in a way that, what you were thinking 2 years or 3 years ago, you're now looking at these people as if they're terrible people? Were you a terrible person at that time, or do you see it differently?
I'm not looking at them as terrible people as much as I'm looking at them as frenzied, ideologically indoctrinated, and basically, I consider them as having been infected by some leftist ideology, by a meme or a virus, if you will. I see it as a kind of infection or a kind of overtaking of the mind. I don't think that they're bad people intrinsically. I have no way of knowing that. I know their actions are outrageous, but I think mostly. Here's the thing about the whole Antifa movement. I would like to say is that they're against all sorts of privilege. They're against other people making a living. They're against anything that's about capital gains or any not capital gains, but just capitalism and any remunerative activity. Anything that seems to be endorsing the status quo, they'll call fascism, and they attack it vehemently. But they're only able to do this out of a position of privilege, because these kids would not have the time, the resources, the way of expending their lives without worry of becoming absolutely destitute if they didn't come from probably middle and upper middle class, I would say mostly upper middle class backgrounds. They're predicated, their whole platform, their whole modus operandi is predicated upon their own privileged backgrounds. So that's very curious. And so it's a kind of Oedipal issue as well, I think. They're attacking their own backgrounds. They're killing their own families, in effect, their own father figures or other sacrificial scapegoats as a way of resolving some sort of interior conflict, I think. They're not to get psychological about it.
No, that's okay. I agree with Frederick Cruz, who was a Freudian at one point in his career. I'm not actually familiar with his work, but I read his one book on Freud, and he basically says Freud is a fraud. Mm-hmm. So if you want to use Oedipus complex as a sort of a metaphor, then that's fine. I mean, kids do rebel against their parents. That's true. I rebelled against my parents a little bit. But sure. I think focusing on the meme virus is good, because ideas do take hold. But I think they can take hold of anyone, just like Freudianism took hold, and Marxism, and it goes on and on. So no one's exempt from mind viruses.
That's for sure.
But you should at least debate your critics rather than try to extinguish them. I think that's the key difference, between certain elements on the right versus the left. Not that everyone on the left wants to exterminate their opponents. They don't.
Right.
So that leads to my question is, how important are these fringe groups?
Well, they have a certain symbolic significance, I think. They represent the avant-garde of their respective tribes, if you will. And I think since they have the implicit or actually explicit endorsement of many figures that are in the political realm, in the political sphere, actual politicos who have political power, I think they are significant, because they're being used as a wedge or a kind of weapon to create a kind of space for insurrection of a sort. They're kind of the leading edge of the resistance, if you will, the battle axe of it. And I think they're meaningful in a sense that I don't think their numerical constitution makes any real dent. But nevertheless, I think they have they're able to, or they are not articulating, but they're representing a political meaning that's very visible in the public sphere. Therefore, I think they're important in that way. Not that they're good. I think they're important in the sense that they need to be opposed pretty visibly as well, and articulately. But yeah, I know they're a small band of vanguard ragamuffins, but they're nevertheless significant from a social, symbolic standpoint.
Right. I have an acquaintance, I won't go any further than that.
Okay.
Who is a very bright man, a scientist, graduated from one of the top universities in the U.S., that's associated with science. One of the techs, shall we say.
I got it nailed down to
Okay.
2 or 3 already. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Not people, but places.
Right. So he was, and my memory's a little hazy on this, but I got into a little Facebook scrap with him about defending Antifa. He had posted something by this high school history teacher. Yes, a great source, no doubt. I mean, nothing against high school teachers. I'm sure some of them are very bright and well-read. But the high school teacher was defending Antifa because he thought that George Orwell would have defended Antifa. And that could very well be true depending on what stage of Orwell's career we're talking about. Probably not late Orwell, but maybe early Orwell. We're talking about a man who maybe endorsed the shooting of priests at one point because he had sided with the Republicans in Spain. But anyway, I had a great source in my back pocket, though, an Orwell scholar named David Ramsey Steele. So I said, well, let's bring Dr. Steele into this this little debate, and I tagged him, and he showed up, which was great because it doesn't always work out that way. And it was very much like that moment in the Woody Allen film where Marshall McLuhan comes behind the sandwich board. It was very much like that. If you're familiar with that scene. Right, exactly. And they all scurried away like rats. They realized, oh, an Orwell scholar, I'm not going to debate this guy. I'm not going to stand behind a high school teacher. No, so they were, but I just thought it was really odd that these middle-class gentlemen living in middle-class homes, it wasn't just him, it was probably a few of his friends, you know. And it just struck me as odd. It was just like this scene I saw in my own neighborhood where they had BLM scrawled in chalk. One of the homeowners' children had done it, scrawled on their driveway. And I'm looking at this fabulous home, and I'm thinking, well, you're endorsing BLM, maybe you don't know what it's all about, but are you really going to do much for these people that you supposedly care so much about? Are you going to give half your income away or something? It just seems like a lot of silly virtue signaling, but it sort of reminded me in a way of Leonard Bernstein. He used to invite Black Panthers to dinner parties and stuff like that. Sort of radical chic, it was called. I think it was dubbed by Thomas Wolfe, I guess.
Right. Wolfe was a great critic of all this stuff, yeah.
Right.
Tom Wolfe, not to be confused with Thomas, the novelist, yeah.
Right. I guess they're both novelists, but there is a distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, I would call one a great novelist. But yeah, Tom Wolfe wrote a great novel, Vanity of the Bonfire, yeah.
Yeah, Bonfire
of Vanity, sorry.
Right. Worthy enough to be made into a movie. That's how good it was. But
that was a pretty good novel. Yeah, but go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm not sure where I was going. I just see these parallels, and I just wanted to share that one little anecdote because it's odd to me that we have the middle class some elements of the middle class identifying with Antifa.
Yeah.
Even if they scurry away when they have to defend certain views about Orwell.
To say that Orwell would endorse them when they seem to represent perfectly some of his concept of the prohibition of wrongthink, the doublespeak, the newspeak, basically a lot of the things that they embody perfectly. And that, they are they're contradictions, like everything is the opposite of what they say it is. They're anti-police, and then the first thing they did upon taking over this territory was to say, we are the police. So they claim to be for sort of liberation, but they're utter authoritarians. I was just reading last night again. I hadn't read it for 23 years, but I'm preparing a class on cultural Marxism, including the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Postmodern Theory, and Cultural Studies. And I was reading Herbert Marcuse's essay called Repressive Tolerance. And in that essay, it is the most convoluted logic. But basically the thesis is we have to suppress particular thought in order to have tolerance. Toleration requires the intoleration of thoughts that would, if expressed, create an environment of suppressive toleration, repressive tolerance. So he actually advocates a repression of views, and then he says which views should be repressed, and that's anything on the right, and only leftist views are for liberation, so they have to be not only allowed but actually amplified in order to overcome the status quo, which he sees as oppressive, exploitative, on and on and on.
It makes sense, though, in a way. There's sort of like an internal logic there that people can grasp. If you see the world, if you do actually see capitalism and other cultural aspects related to it, and certain institutional factors in your society, you could very well see it as oppressive and want to liberate yourself, and therefore you would want to prevent bad memes from spreading, obviously.
Right. That's what they were trying to do, basically stop the expression of what he called regressive ideas, and only promote and allow the expression of progressive ideas. And then he got into a bit of a conundrum as to who is to decide this. And he said it could be decided objectively based on knowing what policies would be progressive and which would not be, and therefore which people should be allowed to speak and which shouldn't. So that's where the problem comes in for me, the arbiter.
Right. I mean, that's obvious criticism. Even if you can make a case that certain aspects of society are oppressive, sure, you can say the police can be oppressive. I'll never forget, as a young boy in high school, we were walking home fairly close to school, and some cops offered to give us a ride, and they were white cops, and I guess there were some it was a mixed race school, so there were black kids walking, home at the end of the day.
Sure.
And so they offered to give some friends a ride, my friends and me, and I don't exactly remember the context, but he made some sort of reference to the N-word. I mean, motioning to the black kids. And that really stuck with me.
Sure.
So you could take examples like that and run away with them.
Right.
To the conclusion that America is, should be spelled with a K instead of a C.
Right.
Like they did in the 60s. But you're right, though. If
and still do.
Who's the arbiter? Right. Who's the arbiter going to be? I mean, clearly that's illiberal. That can't. That's a cul-de-sac. Of totalitarianism, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, he's supposedly favoring, or should I say, he supposedly opposes totalitarianism, but then he suggests what I consider to be totalitarian measures in order to oppose it.
I think in one of his books he said that all reason has fled to Moscow. I don't remember if that's definitely Marcuse or which book it was, but I don't think there was much reason in Moscow. Well, there's always reason, but certainly wasn't the citadel of reason. I don't know.
No, and he fails to mention the Soviet Union here when he talks about revolutions that have brought about positive change. He mentions China, Cuba, but he leaves out the Soviet Union, and he did this for a lot of his work, because the Soviet Union stood as a real counterexample for everything they were suggesting, especially in the sense of this kind of policing of opinion and this kind of opposition to anything considered non-oppositional, anything not politically correct. And that is not just a fashionable term in the United States. That's a term that was invented by Vladimir Lenin. I can't pronounce it in Russian, but it was obviously Russian. And politically correctness was merely towing the party line perfectly. And it meant on all matters of opinion. He even says here that opinions, not just what you say, but certain opinions should not be allowed. Opinions should be stamped out. So that's pretty dramatic. And, he says you can't tolerate these opinions at all. So I don't even know how you get to know people hold these opinions unless you actually allow them to speak.
Right.
That's another paradox there. So I guess you allow them to speak long enough to prove what they have to say is deleterious and nefarious and has to be stamped out. But I don't know. it doesn't seem to make sense. It's certainly not the notion of tolerance that I think makes sense, and basically anti-libertarian, authoritarian in effect. So,
right.
In your days in academic world, where you were a communist, as you
Yeah.
said, you were not a Marcusian, and you were not for totalitarianism. So how did you react to that at the time before you became beyond woke?
well, I considered myself a left communist, and that means that I opposed the usurpation. What I saw as the usurpation of the revolution in the Soviet Union as a takeover by the party and then state dictators, and that in fact there is this kind of free collaboration and a libertarian version of communism, which is about the free association of the collective, of people working and in a collective and not with a state supervening, and so on and so forth. But I've since come to see that as impossible.
Well, did you take any interest in the nuts and bolts of it all? Did you?
Yeah, no.
Or were you too caught up in your own academic niche?
It was theoretical for the most part, and my academic work didn't involve this, but I published a lot in this area in Marxism, Marxist thought. I didn't take up the history as much as I could have. I have studied history of the Soviet Union a lot more than I had at that point.
Well, I meant the economic aspects.
The economics for sure. I wrote on political economy, several essays published on political economy, and I worked with various Marxist economists to write co-authored papers and things like that. I believed in the labor theory of value, therefore the notion of exploitation or the extraction of surplus value at the point of production, which I no longer believe in at all. I think it's failed. I would say that the labor theory of value is to economics what vitalism is to biology. It's totally antiquated, and it has no. I don't think you can say that value is determined by the socially average amount of labor time invested in a commodity. It just doesn't hold. It doesn't stand up. There's all kinds of auxiliary clauses that have to be added on. So it's not. Certainly, it doesn't pass the test of parsimony.
Not to denigrate you in any way. I mean, we all have blind spots, of course. But all these refutations were probably available in the 1800s.
Ssure.
People.
Well,
how did you miss them? I guess is what I'm asking.
What happens is when you get into Marxism, it's a huge corpus of reading in itself. So what happens is it occupies you entirely. So you just read in this vein. You read Marxist texts of all sorts, and there is no light shined on anything outside of it. It gets to be very, very insular. So you don't read critiques. You don't even hear of them. I still know many Marxists never heard of Mises, for example. Never heard of him. Or if they did, they dismiss him. Oh, yeah, he's that guy that said that he's that guy that postulated the calculation problem. That's been disproven. Enough. That's all they know. Basically, that's it. They don't know about its demolition of socialism. So I can't fault myself that much, except that I would say I got into a sort of tunnel vision, if you will, and you're working on becoming expert in what you're doing. So you don't want to waste your time on areas that don't feed into that vein. So similarly in academia, you do the same thing. You become so tied. My academic niche was 19th century science and culture, and effectively, and then it became secularism, the development of secularism in Great Britain. As a movement, as a worldview movement, not as the political, not political secularism, but what they call worldview secularism. Anyway, you get so tied into these niches, you don't have time to look anywhere else. Just to be proficient, and then to be great at it, you really have to blind yourself to other things. So why didn't Marcuse read Mises, for example? Never. Of course, they wouldn't even consider it.
Well, I think they were very much like you in that since they weren't economists, they just assumed, they use a heuristic like so many other people do. And this is true of almost anyone. Well, so-and-so is really smart. He's a socialist.
Yes.
He has an IQ of 160 or whatever,
Right.
whatever your criteria might be. He allegedly refuted Mises. End of story. I don't need to read all that stuff. I can go on doing my academic work.
Exactly.
Next.
And that's exactly what happens. And, you're trying to build on your reading of this corpus rather than looking at the critics generally. Although I did know, of course, I know the history of the Soviet Union and China, and I don't think that I argued against both of them as failed projects, and actually I called them more or less, I would say that I considered them hijackings, and they were not orthodox Marxist for the most part.
Well, that's probably true, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe Marx would have condemned them himself.
No, whenever Russia started looking revolutionary, he switched himself and said he wasn't a Marxist either.
Right. Well, he wasn't consistent. I mean, well, given that there were so many flaws in his body of thought, we shouldn't be surprised that he was inconsistent.
Right.
Working on, building on a flawed work.
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric that passes as thought. And this is why I've become such a nasty critic of the left, because I'm kind of pissed off that I bought into this rhetoric. The rhetoric replaces actual cogitation. You just throw out these words, and that's enough. Without actually penetrating their meaning, their abstractions, without actually taking apart what these abstractions stand for, then you just sort of go along with it, and you use them when necessary to patch together certain arguments. Here's a weak point. Throw in some more rhetoric mud, You
mean BS?
Yeah, that's right.
You probably have some follow-ups, Timo. I kind of hijacked the conversation.
Well, the title of your current book, Beyond Woke, is about woke. Now, I was making fun of wokeness a few years ago, and a friend of mine said, well, how can you be against the word? It's just good, African-American street lingo.
Yeah.
And I had not known of its origin, if that's the origin, because I just heard it from white woke people.
Right. It was an African-American term. It meant, first of all, it just meant sort of like hip to what's going on. Then it took on the meaning of conscious of social and economic injustice, particularly as it related to minorities and blacks, especially blacks. So to be woke was to be woke to social and political injustice. How can I be saying something that can be beyond woke? Well, I think wokeness is it's another form of totalitarian ideology. I'm not saying we live in a totalitarian state, but it is a totalitarian ideology in that it's the same sort of it has the same sort of impulses that it is politically correctness hyped up on steroids, if you will. And it has the same sort of impulses as that. It has the same sort of impulses as the Cultural Revolution. In fact, what does our current situation with the left resemble more than the Cultural Revolution in China?
Right.
Which to me is a travesty of human affairs.
I have a libertarian friend, and he has often said that political correctness is totalitarianism, whereas a lot of people say, oh, it's just good manners, but it's demanding conformity.
It's enforcement. And I wrote an essay, and it's in Beyond Woke, it's called Why Political Correctness is Incorrect. And it's incorrect because it's about force, it's about political correction. It's a form of, it's instrumentalized as a way of correcting people for not holding the right views, and then, of course, now canceling them in total.
It sometimes, though, it feels as if people who are in the classical liberal tradition, or even just, moderate liberals, they're sort of balancing on a knife's edge. Like, on one hand, they criticize political correctness and the totalitarian impulses behind it, or just the conformity. On the other hand, they do tend to be politically correct themselves in a way. For example, you said African American instead of black.
Yeah, well, I would usually say black. I don't know why I said that. It doesn't matter.
I don't know, right? We're all corrupted now, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing is, we all adhere to the colorblind society. We're all against racism. Nobody wants to stand up for freedom of association. We're all against people who are violent towards blacks.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're extremely critical and nasty towards those who just want to be, say, live separately. You don't necessarily have to be a white nationalist and start forcing people to leave areas and so forth.
Right.
But but the idea that someone would want to live in, say, an all-white community is just intolerable to anyone. And yeah, I mean, obviously not. Even conservatives won't go that far. So in a sense, we're all ruled by political correctness now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, but I think that what it comes down to, I think, is not just good manners, but it's enforcement of a progressively narrow banding of ideologically accepted speech and behavior, but especially expression. So the problem is that it moves without any notice, and it changes its terms upon a dime, and then it enforces them with the fervor and with a totalitarian impulse behind it. So I think that the answer to that is they say, well, if you say you don't see color, you're a racist. I see color. I'm not blind. I certainly see the historical dimensions of black life in the Americas and everywhere else, and I'm not proud of it, but I'm not actually guilty for it either.
Right.
And I think that this is a paralegal apparatus that's being used to not just in fact, not even to liberate blacks, but actually to punish others. So I've talked about this in Beyond Woke, and I talk about it in Springtime for Snowflakes, that the social justice movement is about inverting the hierarchy. And it's about taking the putative subordinates and putting them on top, and putting the top and either putting them below your feet or just utterly throwing them out of the social order. So what that comes down to is not egalitarian, of course. This is a sort of inversion ideology, and Nietzsche wrote about this at length, and that's why I think he's a great inoculation against this stuff. Not to embrace his notion of the Übermensch, but just the critique of its opposite, which is very, very pernicious. The opposite is. The critique is withering. So, does that answer that?
I think so. One of the things that you go into early in your introduction to Beyond Woke, you talk about how wokeness is analogous to Christian encounter of being saved.
Yeah.
And so there's a religious element here. And after all, it's in the Gospels that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So there's a Christian element to all of the left, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. But that's correct. And there is that. There's in the left. There's always been the same eschatology. There's been an adoption of Christian eschatology. That is the terminus of all this. But the thing is that there's a misinterpretation of Christianity, and it's turning it into an imminent social matter rather than an eschatological matter that has to do with not. There's never going to be equality on Earth. This idea that they can exact it is utterly impossible. So it's the utopianism that I reject. I reject utopianism because utopianism is just, utopians are just totalitarians waiting to happen.
And there's not going to be a colorblind society either.
No.
I don't think you can erase ethnic divisions. I mean, you can achieve some sort of social peace under certain institutions,
right,
where there's a modus vivendi. you live your way and I'll live mine.
Right.
But it seems like they expect a whole lot more.
They expect a whole lot
it's
more.
It's actually quite weird as well. That's the thing. The way white people, I mean, I would expect it from blacks, of course, because they might feel that they're receiving the brunt of it if there's oppression, and there has been. But whites almost seem obsessed with it. And every once in a while, I'll see you drop that word cuck. I understand the satisfaction in using it. Obviously, it's an alt-right term. And just because you use it doesn't mean you're endorsing the alt-right. But
let me take it back and call it cuckold then. That's the word.
Right. Right. Well, most of us know where it comes from. But sometimes it feels satisfying to say it out loud. It's like we're seeing the cuckification of our nation.
Right.
And it's weird.
It is weird. But just to go back to the use of such words for a second, no, I consider myself a civil and uncivil libertarian, whatever the case may be. In other words, I can be uncivil at times, and that's too bad. That's part of being a civil libertarian, is to be able to be uncivil in some sense. To be beyond woke not only means to be beyond their group compulsion, which is how they enforce everything through compulsion rather than real morality, but it also means not to obey and to be disobedient. And I think that's important. John, I heard you folks talking about John Stuart Mill. I think John Stuart Mill talks about the tyranny of public opinion. And we're undergoing it right now, the tyranny of public opinion. I embrace Mill's civil libertarianism. I don't embrace his later contemporary liberal notion of economics, but I think he was right about a lot of the civil libertarian issues.
Well, one of my friends received essentially a death threat. I mean, this is nothing new, of course, and you've probably received some yourself. But he posted the comment, and the guy said, "You come anywhere near me, I'm going to cut you," he said. Cut you. Because he disagreed. And it wasn't as if this person was saying, yeah, I want to get out there and put my knee on the neck of black people. I'm sure that's probably what the context was, the George Floyd issue.
Right.
And I know he wasn't saying anything. He's not an illiberal person.
Right.
But the idea that he might not be sufficiently woke means that he has to be cut. And of course, I'm sure it was an idle threat. Keyboard warrior.
Right.
But not all of these are idle threats. Right. They're not all idle. I understand that, but
Antifa put a target on my back at one point in New York. I was on Antifa New York's hit list, in effect. They wanted to get me, so I had to put out my own counter message that I was dangerous. I had to make that clear. I had to say, I had to, use all this bravado and so forth to suggest you don't want to do that. And I think it worked because I had to make implicit statements to the fact that I was armed and that I was dangerous if they infringe my rights.
As well you should.
Yeah.
Now, back to your explanation of wokeness, which I find fascinating. You say that Christians are saved not by works, but into works. So the newly converted social justice believers are woke, not by works, but into woke works, which I think is a great phrase. But when I read that, I thought of Bonhoeffer's talk of cheap grace. And is that kind of, is there an anxiety of not being woke enough on the left? Is that a huge deal for the woke? It seems like it, but I'm not sure.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge anxiety. It's fueled by guilt, and it's fueled by fear. I think it's greatly fueled by fear. I think I talk about this in the book. There's two. I think I try to examine herd mentality and what drives it. There's two factors. One is fear of the herd itself, makes you cling to the herd, makes you envelop yourself in the herd, and then the seeking of herd protection against the outsider is another element. So those two elements together make it almost insuperable. Herd compulsion becomes almost insuperable. And then if you add the element to that you're you're morally more noble for being as such. That's another element as well. So you have this idea that you're more noble, you're after a noble end, you fear the herd implicitly without saying so, and you also seek the herd's protection against others. That is just a sociological or social analysis. It's not a political thing. It's about what kinds of social psychological mechanisms are at work, I think. But they're definitely fearing not being woke enough for those reasons, I think.
Yeah,
they know what happens to those who don't abide. They can see those there's examples made of these people. So,
right, I was just going to mention that a third element, and this is something that my libertarian friend, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, emphasizes. These people delight in persecuting other people. They're basically an army of Karens, except with regard to racism instead of masks, although there's that aspect too. And I think that's just a sad statement, I guess, about human nature. I mean, sure, they think they're doing the right thing. As you said, they're infected with these mind viruses.
Yeah.
Sounds like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I know you weren't being quite that hyperbolic, but that persecution aspect, I mean, you have a weapon that you can wield. It doesn't have to be a gun. Now you can threaten someone's job, in a sense, their livelihood.
Yes.
So if they don't have a YouTube channel, they're kind of doomed, you know?
Yeah, that's right. And even if they do. We brought up this idea of persecution, and actually, I think it ties into some reading I've been doing by René Girard. I don't know if you've ever read him. René Girard had a whole theory of violence and the scapegoat mechanism as the main driver of human culture, and the sacrifice of others and scapegoating of the sacrifice of the scapegoat as the primary mechanism by which culture is produced. And I think that's what's going on here. And one of the things about the scapegoat is that you have to project all of your own evil, if you will, onto the other, and then they become the object of that. And Gerard goes into how it becomes for Christians, it becomes Jews, but because they are able to scapegoat Jews for not being Christian and not accepting Christ, and he goes into a very, very nice explication of the Gospels to show that Christ was actually, when he's condemning the Pharisees, he's also condemning the listeners who are putatively new Christians. They're followers of him. And they exempt themselves from the criticism, which is part of the whole mechanism that allows them to continue it. It's the continuation of the sacrifice of the scapegoat in history in order to exalt and to exclude and to exempt one from any kind of primordial participation in this human drama, this human history, which is, he says, predicated on murder, and that this is the problem, is when with zealots like this, is they actually have this notion of complete and total innocence, which is only by virtue of the fact that they've projected away from themselves and projected onto the scapegoat all the proclivities and so forth that they see in themselves. And this also explains why they're able to commit tremendous violence against others, including blacks and black business owners and their property, in the name of Black Lives Matter. It makes sense that way. They've got to have a victim.
Collateral damage in a way, though, isn't it?
Well, they need a victim, because they need to perpetrate this idea. They need to perpetrate a scapegoat mentality, a scapegoat mechanism, which drives things forward for them. It gets them free from, it gives them an exemption, a pass on guilt. And I'm not talking about race guilt here. I'm talking about a more primordial guilt that everybody participates in, I think. And that, I say, as a Christian, and that is, I'm a Christian in a very profound sense, is that I think the world is broken and flawed. irredeemably in this life, so that I don't imagine anyone as being innocent, and that the imagination of oneself as innocent is the driver of much and most, if not all, violence. So how else do you reconcile, like Lenin, very soon after the revolution, and this is other things that Marxists won't acknowledge, Lenin was a butcher. I mean, right after the revolution, the first people that went on strike were shot. I mean, this was supposedly a revolution for the working class, and yet he shot the first striking workers. How do you possibly justify that in that context of that ideology? And then they'll say, well, you know, a lot of people were killed during World War I by capitalism and World War II by capitalism, but how capitalism is responsible for World War I or II, it's hard for me to judge. I mean, you know, and imperialism and so forth. I think imperialism precedes free markets, the marketplace, the flourishing marketplace. So I don't blame capitalism for that. Anyway, I'm expatiating at length here.
That's quite all right.
Field another question.
Yeah, I was listening to Spike podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with the magazine Spike.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So there's a podcast hosted by the editor, Brendan O'Neill, and he was interviewing Trevor Phillips, who was a member of Blair's government, Labor government, in the 90s, I guess, or early 2000s, or whenever he was in there. And he had something to do with diversity. Mm-hmm. And he's Afro-Caribbean. And eventually he broke away from the or at least the politically correct version of multiculturalism, mm-hmm. and then incurred the wrath of the left. Although he's still a member of the Labor Party because he just doesn't want to give up on them. I guess rather than be driven out, he'd rather drive them out, you know, the PC elements. But anyway, one of the things he said during the podcast was that white people, as part of their struggle, you know, we're talking about the more radical left, the Corbynites, I guess, I had written it down. Let's see if I can make sense of my handwriting here. Well, they're basically, and many people have said this before, but they're using minorities because if you build a coalition, then you're more able to achieve what you want. And then you get the votes that you want. So it creates this Labor Party factionalism, he said, and he referred to them as stage armies. Mm-hmm. Now, when you were a member of the left, I mean, obviously you weren't thinking, oh, let me use black people to achieve my Marxist revolution. But there's something to that, it seems.
Oh, yeah. And as a Marxist, I was a very, very strenuous, strident critic of identity politics and the fetishizing of identities and the fetishizing of identity politics and the use of it. So I guess I went against that sort of Marcusian notion of cobbling together these identity groups. I think that they use identity categories as weapons, as you're saying. It's weapons. They're not just tools, they're actually weapons in order to exact vengeance on those who they deem to be the minority's enemies, which are also their enemies. So they find the enemies of of blacks and make them their enemies as well, and use them and their plight as a justification for attacking their enemies. And then they build, you know, if you get into how it translates into votes, they build allegiance that way, of course. And by all the, I mean, as we can see with Democrats and their pathetic kneel down in Congress, it's an attempt to placate so that you then...
Cuckification.
Yeah, it's cuckification.
It's pathetic.
But they blew it with they had a cross leftist conflict where they culturally appropriated an indigenous African garb and got called out on the carpet for it. So they're exempt. They get an exemption based on whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Marcuse earlier, and I may have this wrong, and I've referred to this libertarian friend many times. He's not imaginary, I swear.
Okay.
It's not just asking.
I have an libertarian friend I got libertarian friends.
Yeah. So asking for a friend. So this friend of mine he's an ex-Marxist and now a libertarian.
I'd like to meet him.
Yeah, he lives in the UK. So he's 70 years old, and
Okay.
and he used to read a lot of he used to read a lot of these publications when he was a Marxist. Like one of them was Marxism Today, which I think was a breakaway from Morning Star, which was the Communist Party organ.
Right.
And he seemed to recall, and his memory could be faulty, but that there was a time where Marxism Today abandoned the working class for minorities, and maybe Marcuse was involved in that, and Angela Davis.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that we see this in the mainstream society, because there are very few actual Marxists, very few communists, and so forth. But these ideas have percolated up from these fringe groups, it seems. Yeah. It's just, that's another part of that weirdness that I was talking about earlier, that we get these people behaving in such, or just mouthing these, or basically, Marxist ideas.
Yeah.
But they're not really Marxist. They don't want to overthrow capitalism.
Well, there's some of that, but, so I said the other day, I think it was yesterday, I said that, or the day before, and then Glenn Beck mentioned it in the program, that I said that the left has translated Marxism into identity politics. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement, they've translated identity politics back into Marxism. So they definitely, there's the movement for Black Lives, which is the umbrella group under which Black Lives Matter is situated, they're anti-capitalist. So they're not maybe they don't have the theory of Marxism, Don, but they have an antipathy for capitalism.
Right.
So in that sense, they're good enough for Marxists for now. We'll train them later is the idea, Then once we get them involved, then we can start ridiculing them for not knowing anything. That's part of the fun. I'm serious. This shit all goes on,
That may happen elsewhere besides just Marxists.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean, that's my target because why? Well, I spent years in it, I'm basically anti-leftist. That's my main orientation right now. I mean, I can't help it. It's what I have to do to work myself through it.
Well, when you started your Twitter campaign, you first called yourself Deplorable NYU Prof.
That's right.
So to what extent were you tweaking them with the image of Trump and the Trump, Trump followers, or what were you are you trying to make a bigger point, or how did you deal with the Trumpian element?
Well, the reason I called myself deplorable was to signal my not solidarity, but my sort of my sympathy for the Trump people who were thrown into this basket of deplorables and deemed irredeemable. These kind of people that were deemed to be beyond the pale. And I thought I would just mark myself with them as a token gesture of affiliation in that sense of being beyond the pale. So I wasn't a Trumpy at that point. I'm not really a Trumpy now. I'm not a Trumpist or a Trumpy or whatever they call it. Although I do enjoy his triggering campaigns. I love it. I think it's very fun and it's sort of a spectacle that I quite enjoy. It's so easy that but anyway, it was part of a trigger for the other side as well. I got to admit that. I even said that this Twitter handle and the tweets that I put out, they were somewhat satirical, and they were somewhat it was mobilizing satire to an effect, right? Right. I mean, that's what satire is. Satire is making a point in an exaggerated way in order to underscore a reality that's out there that you would like to be critical of. That's what I was doing.
Right.
I can't disavow my literary bent. I can't help it. I got a literary bent.
Well, speaking of a literary bent, you have a novel in the works, I understand.
Yeah. It's called The Virus.
Oh, great title.
Yeah, titles are my thing.
Can we get you to read something from it?
Well, I mean, if you think that's appropriate, I would like to. How should I start in the middle or just anywhere.
Wherever you think it's appropriate.
And what did you say the title was again?
The virus.
Okay.
Let me read a part that sort of will give you the backlog. It's chapter 5 called Eraserol. Eraserol is the name of a drug that these, what I call thought deviationists, are taking in order to ward off the virus. This entity called collective mind is effectively connecting people's neocortexes to itself vis-a-vis this virus, which attaches, it's basically nanorobots that are made of DNA that attach to the neurons of the neocortex and then establish connections to this collective mind, which then therefore controls most of the neuronal activity in the brain, okay? So this part of it is kind of the romantic part in a way, and also it kind of gives you the some of the backdrop. It's called Eraserol. Case Varen and Ginger Husserl planned to rendezvous at their favorite spot, the bottom of a winding set of steps that led from Highway 1 down to New Brighton Beach in Capitola, California, just outside of Santa Cruz. And instead in Santa Cruz is this transhuman university, which is TransU for short. Since the onset of the virus, an order from the governor of California made sitting or standing on dry beach sand illegal. It was still legal to sit or stand on the wet sand, but of course it was impossible to reach wet sand without first passing through dry sand, so beach going was effectively banned. New Brighton Beach, however, had the advantage of being partially obscured by a grass and tree-covered cliff that hung like a shelf over the beach's furthest edge. The plan was to meet beneath the shelf and hopefully remain hidden. Varen would not leave his car in the beach lot, which would tip off the RPAs, which are robot police agents, but rather a few hundred feet up the road in the lot of the restaurant that would be closed due to the virus response measures. Ginger would travel by a driverless car so that no third party would know of her arrival at the forbidden beach in advance. Nobody but the It Drive system itself, that is. Varen rode from Kansas to California without sleeping. By the time he reached the CA border, California, in the early morning hours, he began hallucinating. He saw a giant truck lying horizontally across the highway that he'd surely run into unless he slammed on the brakes at once, which he resisted doing. He saw a small fleet of police cars in the rearview mirror and then the police car beside him in the left lane. He saw a pack of coyotes running chaotically into the highway and scrambling as the car approached. If he had been driving the car, he surely would have pulled over, but he wasn't driving the car, so he more or less enjoyed the theater. Since receiving Case's text, Ginger's outlook changed considerably. Her suicidal ideation went into remission, and she even began to consider resuming the dissertation, regardless of the committee's rejection of her plan. She might even make it a book instead. Life beyond TransU could be possible. He was a professor there, but he got fired for thought deviationism, she thought. But she decided she wouldn't begin anything until she reconnected with Case. Their meeting was set for noon. At 11:30, she put on her bubble mask and attached the hose and oxygen tank, then tapped the It Drives app to arrange for the car. After finally sleeping for 5 hours at a rest stop, Varen approached San Jose by 11:25. He wanted to assert some control over the car, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he enjoyed commandeering a vehicle. Highway 17 stretched out before him, an open road with no cars or trucks in sight for miles, thanks to the virus response. Despite the car's active monitoring and reporting on its own speed to the San Jose Smart City databases, he sped along at 175 kilometers per hour, well over the speed limit. No RPAs were in sight, and even if he was automatically data tagged, his account wouldn't be debited because the funds would have been insufficient to cover the fine. It was a safe account that didn't overdraw but merely returned any charges over the balance. No matter how thick the data net became, he thought, minor loopholes could always be found and exploited. It was as if no system, however elaborate and thorough, could ever be completely closed. Ginger's car arrived at the top of the steps above New Brighton Beach at 11:50. She got out and instead of descending the widening steps, she walked along Highway 1. The road and its alleys were vacant except for small flocks of birds chirping and diving between trees on either side of the highway. The road bent and curved, and she walked along for nearly a mile, feeling like the last human biological on the face of the earth. For the first time in many months, if not years, she relished the sun beaming on her bare arms, the back of her neck and face. Not even collective mind could prevent her from experiencing, however faintly, these few moments of joy, although expressing that joy would have been vain in the absence of another human biological. So she turned around and hurried back. She'd been a half hour and now was panicked that she might miss Case at the bottom of the steps. But Varen, his last name he uses, but Varen was late in arriving anyway. After speeding past San Jose, he slowed down in Santa Cruz. The once familiar sights now appeared strange, almost as if he'd never seen them before, but more so because he had, and they weren't the same. As hostility clung to the streets, stores, and houses. They reproached him for something he'd done. He felt guilty, as if he'd committed some unforgivable wrong. The asphalt, the concrete, the bricks and mortar, the painted cottages, the brightly colored porch awnings, the lawns and sidewalks, and the mountains above, they all stood implacably by and testified against him. He was a wrongdoer. This was certainly an unexpected welcome, he thought. Yet he was blameworthy for infidelity, but there was more. The town cried out in its own innocence against his reprobate being. Farron pulled into the lot of the Paradise Beach Grill, and before turning to the steps to descend, he noticed a solitary figure on the edge of the highway to the north. It seemed to be standing still, flagging in the wind, and blurred by the moist sea air suffused by sunlight. He kept his eyes on this figure, which soon appeared to be coming closer. At 100 meters, he recognized the gait and stature as Ginger's. Had she walked here, he wondered? Something about her was different than how he remembered her. She seemed to have broken away and become an isolate, floating at sea, a piece of bark or a single plank from a boat that had been shipwrecked, leaving the remainder to continue on by itself after the ship had gone under. She was a whole apart rather than a member of an aggregate as before, saturated with sad resignation mixed with resolute independence. Finally, he saw her hair and face in relief against the deserted background. Her strawberry blonde hair was tossed and her face buffeted by the wind. She had taken off the bubble mask and held it to her side. As her expression became visible at 50 meters, Varen noticed that she'd been crying. Case removed his bubble mask as well and left it in the car with his new PR, which is a palm reader. It's the device for communications. Ginger noticed his wispy blonde hair, which had grown longer and looked wild. His clothes were disheveled and he looked like a castaway. His appearance caused her to burst into tears once more. She walked even faster, and as she got very close, she stretched out her hand as if to shake his, but Varen ignored it and stretched his arms, reaching around her waist and drawing her to his body. Their embrace was at once criminal and consecrated. No words were spoken for minutes. Then they broke away and he motioned toward his car, asking Ginger to leave her PR inside, the personal palm reader. He walked to the cement steps as she followed beside him. They said nothing until they reached the bottom of the beach at the bottom. Case sat down on the dry sand and pulled her by the hand beside him. He began, "I noticed that you've been crying." "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry to hear of your troubles with the dissertation committee." "Thank you, but I wasn't crying about that." "What is it then?" "I was crying because I realized I've lost everything I ever wanted, but recovered myself in the process. I was crying for joy." "You feel relieved in some sense then?" Case asked. "Yes, but also burdened and somehow not terribly afraid." "It's a strange feeling," Case said. "An ambiguous sense when you come clean with yourself, isn't it? When you've let yourself fall with the certainty that you will not die, but not at all sure what you're trusting to catch you. It's almost as if you come to believe in something greater than the world itself, and it looks totally crazy to everyone else." "Yes," Ginger answered, amazed at how synchronized they were. "It's like jumping off a cliff," she said. without a visible net below, but feeling sure that you'll be caught and won't splatter on the rocks or drown in the ocean below. She thought then about her suicidal fantasies, although this wasn't at all the same. I know that feeling very, very well, he said. Well, you got there first. Maybe, but it doesn't matter. Because it's like stepping outside of time, too. It is, so what are we going to do outside of time? She didn't mean to mock him, but thought she might have sounded like she had. He didn't hear it that way in any case. Well, I'm glad I studied more than AI and neurology before graduate school, Case said, and that I didn't merely download packets, but instead actually read and thought about what I read. What do you mean? I mean, I have ideas about our subversion that come from literature, from myth, from history, from religion even. That may even have been the source of my eventual undoing, in fact. There's nothing I can do about it now. I didn't properly prepare for a life without thought, as it were. But it provides some sense for to think about our predicament. Oh, what ideas come to mind? I really want to know, Ginger said. She said this well. For example, he said, our situation reminds me of Voltaire's Candide, the 18th century comical novel that ends with Candide saying, after going through the Inquisition, being robbed, having his lover lose half her ass to a swordsman, thinking his ridiculous mentor has been killed only to reunite with him later, he says, we must cultivate our garden. That's it. That's what he comes to, and it makes perfect sense. What he means is that there isn't any prospect for changing the world at large, of convincing anyone of anything, of ridding it of evil, or even of overcoming the enemy. All we can do is build a small world of our own, an alternative to the larger world, yet not against it, just separate. It won't be a utopia, but it won't be hell either. What then? A parallel processing system, if you will. I meant what will we do then, not what is it then, but I see what you meant. And you're right, that seems to be our only choice. It's not really, though, Varen hurriedly corrected her, because he didn't want to be responsible for a complete defection when one wasn't necessarily determined, for her at least. We could pretend to be revolutionaries, he continued, and charge at windmills, struggling heroically and in vain, resigning ourselves to sure defeat, but a noble cause nonetheless, or all the more, fit for a movie in our own minds. Or we could pretend to believe. You could acquiesce to the dissertation committee's demands, whatever they are, and we need to talk about that. You could banish deviationist ideas or pretend they don't exist in your mind and so forth. As for me, there's no going back. Well, I guess I could shine robots or do some piecemeal programming for companies that know nothing about my history, and collective mind won't prevent them from hiring me as long as I don't do anything theoretical. Or companies that know and don't care as long as I don't deviate again, at least publicly. It would be inglorious, humiliating, and I'd barely eke out a living, but you can still turn back. Write the dissertation they want. Become an assistant professor. Turn out acceptable articles. Develop some software of use to collective mind and so forth. So if you really don't want this fate, this garden, you don't have to accept it. I don't have to either, but my options are fewer and much less attractive. I'm an ex-con, as it were. You're a young grad student who can make it all look like a slight veering off the track thanks to an evil professor, a bit of confusion that collective mind has since rectified. It really is possible, but you'd have to recant more forcefully, express inordinate regret, be a good robot. Wait, I shouldn't have said that. I should have said you could be a useful member of collective mind, respectable, comfortable, and esteemed. I don't know if I can do that, she said. I mean, I can't simply delete my thoughts and forget that I've had them. And they didn't all come from you, so you don't have to be responsible or take all the credit for them either. Also, I really sense there's an alternative, a robust alternative, one that more closely resembles my calling, or if that's too lofty for you, allows the expression of my most prominent talents and abilities, and also that doesn't conflict with my mind, I guess. That's the best word I can find for it. Well, there's the husserl in you, Case joked, but he meant it seriously. I have to tell you something, though, something that may change your mind about me, she said. But before I got the notification of your text, I was about to kill myself. At that, Farron felt rebuked and grew somber. I'm so sorry, he said. There's no need to feel sorry. I didn't mean to joke about what you're facing, he said, or to diminish it. It's every bit as daunting as what I'm facing. If it's not the same, that's only because you're younger and haven't. Never mind. It's every bit as daunting, if not more so, because you're younger. When I didn't hear back from you for weeks, I figured you would never forgive me, or that my message was intercepted, or that you were dead, or had become, I don't know. And so I planned to take a bottle of Eraserol, wash it down with a bottle of whiskey, then jump off the cliff at Davenport Beach into the ocean and drown. Thank God you didn't. What stopped you? Your message. Farron looked at Ginger closely. Her hair blew across her lightly freckled face, and she kept pushing it back over and over. Her raw intelligence beamed from her hazel green eyes. Sadness seemed so out of place for such a wonder. What a wastely god of nature her destruction would have been, he thought. What became of you all these months? Ginger asked after moments. What did they do to you? Well, I don't know exactly what they did to me. I only know what they said they did to me. You can imagine. I have a guess about what they actually did. But after traveling from motel to motel in the Midwest to avoid smart city detection, I was finally picked up and hauled off to a data center in Arizona, a place called Essential Data. And I was told I was being treated for the virus and given the vaccine, then checked for whether the treatment was successful. But I asked for an Eraserol before the process, as they called it, because I suspect it actually works as a vaccine for the virus, and I suspected they were actually administering the virus rather than treating me for it. I can't be sure. Actually, I thought that Eraserol had inoculated me to that point, but I didn't want to ask for it in case they knew about it, so I actually asked for Minuserol. I thought maybe Minuserol would work as well, but they ended up giving me an Eraserol. I could hardly believe it. If they administered the virus, and I suspect that they did, then the Eraserol worked. Because I'm right. If I'm right about the virus, I didn't have it then and I don't have it now. And if I'm right about the process, they tried to infect me with it. They told me they'd given me a blood transfusion, but I can only find one mark on my arm, where they inserted an IV drip. Nothing but saline water, I think. Wait, you think Eraserol works as a vaccine against the virus, Ginger asked, astonished. Yes, I've been taking it for months and I'm dependent on it, though I only take it as prescribed, one per day. You said you'd planned to take a bottle of Eraserol, so you must be on it too. Yes, Ginger replied, I've been taking it for a year. I've tried to get off it, but I can't. I have severe panic attacks and then I go into terrible withdrawal. We're both dependent on it, and that corroborates my theory. Eraserol is effectively a vaccine against the virus. Farron thought he heard something coming down the steps as he was talking. It sounded mechanical. 3 robot dogs bolted toward them, barking and snarling. After seconds, one of the robot dogs spoke in a deep, full-throated voice that sounded like 3 voices or more. By order of the governor of the California region, it is illegal to be sitting on dry sand. You must leave the beach area immediately. And that's that.
Thank you for that.
Sure. And very good. That certainly fits in with our current coronavirus period, as well as the cult of wokeness.
And the big digital and so forth. So I have a conflict going on with this digital connection and the drug and the big pharmaceuticals who peddle the drug. Well, these people have to be on the drug in order to stay off the virus. So no moralizing about drug use.
Okay, very good. It sounds like it might have a play in science fiction readership.
Yeah, it's science fiction. That's the romantic part of it. It's sci-fi where there's all kind of high-tech stuff. I worked in robotics for 5 years at Carnegie Mellon in an AI lab, so yeah, I kind of have a handle on it.
Very good.
Oh, I had no idea. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we're breaking something here.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for letting me read that. I hope it wasn't too long.
No, not at all. It was great. Thank you so much. Do we want to close it out here, Timo?
Well, I did have, since this is a sort of a libertarian podcast, I thought I should ask Michael about his passage about freedom in his new book. You say, by freedom, I don't mean the ability to choose from an unlimited set of possibilities, but rather the necessity that a human must choose it all. This is not a usual take by a almost anyone. This seems very existentialist to me, so I'd be curious if you want to expound on that for a moment.
Yes, I think that freedom is bound up with necessity. And what the necessity is that we must choose at all times. So there is a seeming contradiction between necessity and freedom. Freedom is not an utter willy-nilly set of whimsical choices out of any possible set. It is already constrained by circumstance, but also it's dependent upon ability and so forth. So we don't have a whole universe of unlimited choice. So, but the point of it is that I'm talking about morality, and that without freedom, we have no morality. And that wokeness represents group compulsion, and thus it is not really moral as such. You're not a free moral agent who's able to choose on one's own, on your own. You're actually compelled and compulsed by the crowd to choose. And therefore you actually suborn your own freedom in the act of group compliance.
That makes sense. I mean, they're trying to eradicate bad choices or choices that they feel impact on their various pet groups and so forth.
Right.
And and when you compel someone, they're not really making a free choice. It's sort of like forcing someone at the end of a bayonet to become a Christian, in a sense.
Yeah.
You can mouth all the catechisms, but it doesn't mean you're a true believer.
That's right. The compliance doesn't mean you actually even believe what you're saying or doing. It's just basically surrendering your will over to a group, and you're doing it as a way it's a way to abscond from the real necessity and terror that freedom really is. Freedom, as I think Sartre was right about freedom, about one thing, even though he was a Maoist of all things. He was right about freedom being terrible, terrifying. That we have this freedom to choose, and we have a necessity to choose, which is a terrifying prospect. And they basically abdicate that responsibility in the process of becoming group, herd, compliant members. That's what I was getting at there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. We've been talking for nearly an hour and a half, and
wow.
I really appreciate hearing from you. And I think our audience, which will grow on account of you, is going to really enjoy this.
Okay, great. I thank you for having me and letting me expound on at length here. It's been fun.
Yeah. Don't get too famous, Michael, so we can have you back again, okay?
No, I'm not going to say I'm not going to try.
Well, we wish you well, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice talking.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Well, that was the 14th episode of LocoFoco Netcast. My name is Timothy Virkkala. On behalf of Lee Waaks, I would like to thank Michael Rectenwald for joining us for this episode. And for our listeners and viewers, note that you can find us at locofoco.net and locofoco.us and on podcatchers such as Apple, Google, and Spotify. Thank you.